2:10 in the morning. A man is sitting behind the wheel of a yellow car on a street he has driven down maybe 40,000 times, waiting for somebody to raise a hand. His shift started at 4 in the afternoon. His back has gone from aching to numb. He has eaten once, standing up next to the car. And bolted to the hood of that car is a small numbered piece of metal that he borrowed most of $1 million to buy. And it is now worth roughly what a second-hand van is worth. And he still owes the money. Ask anybody what destroyed the taxi business, and they will tell you the phone in your pocket. An app arrived and the cabs died. That is not what happened. By the time ride-hailing had any real share of the market, the value of that piece of metal on his hood had already started falling. The thing that ruined him was built by his own industry, over about 10 years, out of debt, and the app was only the pin. This is the story of a job that was once a guaranteed route into the middle class, and of how that guarantee was sold to him. So the questions: where did this job actually come from, and why is there a meter in the car at all? Why was a license to drive a taxi in New York once worth more than a house in most of America? When exactly was the best time in history to be a taxi driver, and how would you have known? Why did roughly 9 out of 10 New York cab drivers turn out to be immigrants? And why did the city itself take out advertisements telling them to borrow the money? Today we do one night in the car, and then we go all the way back to a horse in London in the 1600s and follow the job forward to the moment the bottom fell out of it. If you want to understand a trade that 400 years of cities could not do without, subscribe now so you do not miss this one or the ones after it. And we start where he is, at 2:10, because the job itself has barely changed at all. The first thing to understand about driving a cab is that almost none of it is driving. It is waiting and looking. Reading a street for people who might raise a hand, knowing which hotel has a flight crew leaving at 5:30, knowing which theater lets out at 11, and which side of the road they will spill onto. A good driver is not somebody who knows the way. Every phone knows the way. A good driver is somebody who knows where the people are going to be 20 minutes before they get there. And the second thing is that the shift is longer than any office worker would tolerate, and it is that long for a reason that is purely arithmetic. There is a fixed cost sitting on the car before he has carried anybody at all: the lease or the loan, the insurance, the fuel. Those numbers do not care how many fares he gets, so the hours have to be long enough to cover them and then produce a wage on top, which means 12 hours is normal, and the last 4 are the ones that actually pay him. The early part of the shift belongs to the car. The body does what bodies do in a seat. His back and hips have taken the load of a career spent sitting still and braking. He eats at the wheel or standing beside it. He drinks less water than he should, deliberately, because there is nowhere to go in most of Manhattan, and every minute spent finding somewhere is a minute not earning. Ask a group of long-serving cab drivers what the job did to them, and they will tell you about their spine, their knees, and their kidneys, in that order. And nobody will mention a passenger. And the fear is not what you would expect either. Everybody assumes the terror of the job is the stranger in the back seat at 3 in the morning. It happens, and it is real, and there is a partition in that car. But it is not the thing that keeps him awake. What keeps him awake is a number, a payment due on a date, on a debt secured against something that no longer covers it. The danger in the back seat is occasional. The danger on the paperwork is every single month. Which is why the loneliest part of this job is not the night. It is the arithmetic he does in his head while he waits. Fares so far tonight. Fares needed to break even. Fares needed to make the shift worth having left the house for. He knows those 3 numbers at any moment of any shift without writing anything down, in the way that everybody who has ever worked on their own account knows them. And at 2:10, on a quiet street, only the first of those 3 is settled. And here is the part that turns this from a hard job into a genuinely strange one. That car, that seat, that meter, and that piece of metal on the hood are the direct descendants of an arrangement that is nearly 400 years old, and the problem it was invented to solve is exactly the problem it still solves today. Everything about his night, the meter running, the license on the dashboard, the fact that there is a fixed number of these cars in this city, was decided by people who never saw a car. Start in the 1600s, in London and Paris, with a horse and a carriage standing on a street waiting for somebody who needs to be somewhere. They were called Hackney carriages, and the trade grew so quickly that in 1635 London passed the Hackney Carriage Act to try to control it. That is the detail worth holding on to. Within a few decades of the job existing at all, government had already decided it had to be regulated. And that same act, in an evolved form, still governs London's black cabs today. 400 years, same legal ancestor. The vehicle got better before the business did. In 1834, an Englishman named Joseph Hansom introduced the cab that carries his name. 2 wheels, light, and designed above all for maneuverability in congested city streets, which tells you that traffic was already the defining problem of the trade 190 years ago. The hansom cab is the silhouette in every Victorian London illustration you have ever seen, and it existed because the streets were narrow and full. But the trade had a problem that no amount of engineering fixed, and it is the problem that produced everything modern about this job. How does a passenger know the driver is charging the right fare? There was no way to tell. The price was whatever the cabman said it was, negotiated at the curb, in a city where the passenger usually did not know the distance and the driver always did. Every account of the trade in that era comes back to the same complaint, and it is not about comfort or speed. It is about being cheated. The answer arrived in 1891 from a German engineer named Friedrich Wilhelm Gustav Brunn, and it is one of the more elegant machines of the century. The taximeter, and the mechanism deserves describing because it solved the problem completely. When the passenger got in and the cab was standing still, a clockwork mechanism ran and increased the fare with time. When the cab moved, a flexible shaft driven off a front wheel took over and increased the fare with distance. The device automatically used whichever of the two was running faster. Stopped in traffic, the clock charged you. Moving, the wheel charged you, which means the meter was not invented to make money for drivers. It was invented to make the driver trustworthy. And that is the reason the word exists at all. Metered cars became known as taximeter cabs, which shortened to taxi and to taxicab. And the second half of that word goes back to the cabriolet, the light horse-drawn carriage that had been carrying people around European cities for a century. The name of the thing in the street outside your window is a German measuring device bolted onto a French carriage. 6 years after the meter, the machine caught up with it. In 1897, Gottlieb Daimler built the Daimler Victoria, the first petrol-powered, meter-fitted taxicab in the world. It was built for an entrepreneur in Stuttgart named Friedrich Greiner, who used it to start the first motorized taxi company anywhere, and within a decade the change had crossed the Atlantic. In 1907, a company in New York put a fleet of 600 petrol-driven cabs onto the streets at once. By the 1920s, the horses were essentially gone from the trade in every major city. And then comes the moment that created the job as it exists in New York today, and it happened for a reason nobody would guess: the Great Depression. Enormous numbers of people who had lost other work bought a car and started driving it for money, unlicensed operators undercutting the official fares to take customers. They were called wildcat cabs, and there were so many of them that the earnings of licensed drivers collapsed. Too many drivers, not enough passengers, and no floor under the price. So in 1937, under Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, the city passed the Haas Act, and it did one simple thing that shaped the next 80 years. It capped the number of taxis. It created the Medallion, a numbered license, and without one you could not legally pick up a fare in the street. The cap was set at around $13,500, and a license cost $10 to renew. $10. Remember that number, because it is the beginning of the most extraordinary part of the story, and for decades after, the trade filled in the details that make it recognizable. Two-way radios became standard, so a driver could be sent to a caller instead of waiting to be seen. Livery services grew up alongside, restricted to pre-arranged trips rather than street hails, and they operated mainly in the outer boroughs. And in practice, they became the option for passengers whom yellow cabs would not stop for, which is an uncomfortable and well-documented part of the history. And in 1969, a rule made the color official: only Medallion taxis could be painted yellow. So, by the middle of the last century, the job had reached its final form, and every element of it was a response to a specific problem. Regulation, because the trade grew too fast in the 1600s. A light, maneuverable vehicle because the streets were congested in the 1800s. A meter because passengers were being cheated. A cap on numbers because a depression flooded the streets with drivers. A color because people needed to know at a glance which car was licensed. Nothing about that car is arbitrary. And then the cap did something to the license that nobody in 1937 intended, because the number of medallions barely moved for decades while the city grew. That $10 renewal turned into the most valuable small piece of metal in America, which brings us to the golden age of this job, and to the answer to the question of when exactly you would have wanted to be a taxi driver. Before the numbers, one thing about how the medallion actually behaved, because it explains why anybody treated a license as an investment at all. The cap almost never moved. There were fewer medallions in New York in recent years than there had been in 1937, in a city with well over 1 million more people in it. New sales were rare, a limited wave authorized in 2003, and only around 1,800 new medallions issued in total since the mid-90s. Fixed supply, rising demand, for 70 years. Anybody would have drawn the obvious conclusion. Here is the arc in 3 numbers, and they are the only 3 numbers in this video that really matter. In the late 1970s, a New York medallion cost around $50,000. By 2014, an independent medallion was selling for more than $1 million, and by the March of 2017, one sold for $241,000. $50,000, over $1 million, and then a fifth of that inside one working lifetime. So the golden age was roughly the 1940s through to 2013, and being a driver in it meant something specific. It meant that the license you were renting or paying off was appreciating faster than almost any other asset available to somebody without a degree. From the 40s to 2014, medallions were regarded as a straightforwardly good investment. The work was hard and the hours were terrible, and at the end of it you owned something. That was the deal, and for 70 years the deal held. And who was taking it up? Overwhelmingly immigrants. Roughly 9 out of 10 New York cab drivers. For somebody arriving with limited English and limited options, driving was a job you could get immediately, and the medallion was the visible route out of it, the way into the middle class owned outright, no employer required. That is not a retrospective framing invented by journalists. It is how the people buying them described it at the time, and it is why the story of the crash is what it is. Because from around 2004, the city itself began advertising in immigrant newspapers, encouraging drivers to buy medallions. Sit with that for a moment. A municipal government which controlled the supply of the asset, placing advertisements in the papers read by the people most likely to borrow beyond their means to acquire it, describing it as a way to buy into the American dream. And at the time, it was not a lie. That is the difficult part. The asset had risen for 60 years. And the money behind it came from a specific place. And this is where the story stops being about taxis. Prices were driven up by debt. Credit unions and banks lent aggressively against medallions, and a loophole in state law let them classify the deals as business loans rather than consumer loans, which meant the protections that apply when you lend a working person a very large sum did not apply. Between 2010 and 2014, roughly 1,500 people bought medallions, and medallion owners signed at least 10,000 loans in that period. 10,000 loans against 1,500 purchases. That ratio is the whole mechanism, because it means most of that paper was refinancing. Old loans rolled into bigger ones, extensions demanded by banks, medallions pledged as collateral against loans used to buy more medallions. One large fleet owner took over 60 medallions in the 90s and had more than 800 by 2012. The price of the license was no longer set by what a cab could earn. It was set by what a lender would advance against it. The peak came in 2013 at around $1.3 million. And here is the fact that reverses the story everybody knows. Prices peaked shortly after ride-hailing arrived in the city, but before it had any real share of the market. The value was already sliding while the apps were still a curiosity. The taximeter revenue per medallion peaked in the May of 2013 and never recovered. The bubble did not burst because of an app. It burst because it was a bubble, and the app arrived at the same moment and got the blame. What followed was fast, and it was total. Below 900,000 within the same year. Another 40% off in the 2 years after. 250,000 by 2016, 241,000 in early 2017, and eventually transactions at around a tenth of the peak. Hundreds of medallion owners filed for bankruptcy. Credit unions that had built themselves on this lending were closed or merged by the regulator, one of them holding hundreds of millions in medallion loans when it was liquidated. And the people holding the loans were not the people who built the bubble. Some drivers were carrying debts of the order of $800,000 against a license now worth a fraction of it, with no way to sell and no way out. The plan, work the hours, pay it down, sell it, retire, had stopped existing. At least 9 drivers in New York are believed to have taken their own lives in the collapse. The state attorney general opened an inquiry, and federal prosecutors opened a separate investigation into possible lending fraud. And it is worth saying who was on the other side of those transactions, because it was not a faceless market. Large fleet owners had spent 2 decades buying medallions with loans secured against other medallions in a structure that only works while the price rises. One of them filed for bankruptcy on a loan of tens of millions. The critical detail is that when the price fell, the fleets were damaged and the businesses continued, while the individual driver who had bought exactly one license at the top had nothing else to put against it, which is the ordinary shape of every asset bubble, and it is worth naming plainly. The people who inflate the price are diversified, and the people who buy last are not. The fleet owner with 800 medallions is exposed to a market. The driver with one is exposed to a single number, and that number is also his pension, his retirement, and the thing he told his family about. Nothing in that arrangement was unique to taxis. It was only unusually visible because the asset had a number stamped on it and sat on a car in the street. So let us be precise about what actually happened to this job, because the popular version is wrong in a way that matters. Yellow cab revenue itself did not collapse. It fell, but by far less than the value of the license did. What collapsed was not the work, it was an asset price, inflated by lending, sold to the people least able to absorb a fall, by an industry and a market that both had every reason to keep the number going up. The driving still works, the investment did not, and that is why the man at 2:10 is still out there, because the fare he is waiting for is real. Somebody will raise a hand and get in, and be taken where they are going, and pay a fare calculated by a machine invented in 1891 to stop him cheating them. That transaction has worked for 400 years, and it works tonight. What does not work is the thing bolted to his hood, which was never supposed to be an investment at all. It was supposed to be a license that cost $10 to renew. So the next time you get into a cab or open an app, notice what you are actually relying on. Not a route. The phone has that. You are relying on somebody having decided at some point that a stranger will take your money and take you where you said at a price neither of you argues about. That is the thing 4 centuries of cities kept rebuilding. The Hackney Act, the meter, the medallion, the yellow paint, the rating and the app. All of it is the same problem being solved again. How do you trust the man in the front seat? And he is still the same man. That is the strangest part of the whole story. Long hours because the fixed costs come first. Waiting and watching because the fares are not evenly spread, a number in his head that decides whether the shift was worth it. A license on the dashboard because a city decided 400 years ago that this trade cannot be left alone. The car changed, the meter went digital, the app replaced the raised hand. The job did not change at all. Would you have bought the medallion in 2013? Everybody around you says it only goes up. The city is advertising it. The bank has already said yes. Tell us in the comments, honestly, not with hindsight. And if this was interesting, subscribe and give it a like. It helps us make more stories about the work that cities cannot do without. Next time, the man in the control room of a nuclear plant that he shut down 6 hours ago and which is still hot enough to destroy itself.